about treasures in heaven. Verse 19.
I'll go ahead.
Please do, yeah.
19 through what?
24, yes.
24? Do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal, but lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven where neither moth nor rust destroys and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. The lamp of the body is the eye. If therefore your eye is good, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eye is bad, your whole body will be full of darkness. If therefore the light that is in you is darkness, how great is that darkness? Oh, 3:24?
Yes, sir.
No one can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or else he will be loyal to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and mammon.
Then let's read together this section that's on the board here. For this
For this
reason,
reason, I say to you, do not be worried about your life, as to what you will eat or what you will drink, nor for your body, as to what you will put on. Is not life more than food, and the body more than clothing? Look at the birds of the air. They do not sow, nor reap, nor gather in barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not worth much more than they? And who of you, by being worried, can add a single hour to his life? And why are you worried about clothing? Observe how the lilies of the field grow. They do not toil, nor do they spin. Yet I say to you that not Solomon in all glory clothed himself like one of these. But if God so clothes the grass of the field, which is alive today and tomorrow is thrown into the furnace, will he not much more clothe you, you of little faith? Do not worry then, saying, what will we eat, or what will we drink, or what will we wear for clothing? For the Gentiles eagerly seek all these things. For your heavenly Father knows that you need all these things.
but seek first his kingdom
and his righteousness,
and
all these things will be added to you. So do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will care for itself. Each day has enough trouble of its own.
As we began looking through this, you can see that this is a text of contrast. In the beginning, it talks about treasures that are in heaven and on earth. And then the perspective, an eye that is single or an eye that is clear, and an eye that is dark. And talking about our perspective of our soul. And then we have masters, either God or money, material wealth, known as mammon. And then there's a contrast of those who are unbelieving Gentiles, which the term would be for those who are not in the faith, versus God's children, each seeking those things. And the Gentiles eagerly seek, with all their might, their ambition is to get stuff for the body, stuff for the clothing, food, all that kind of thing. Whereas God's people are to seek after his kingdom and his righteousness. And so we end up either with ambition for God or for the world, for the things of this world. And then we have a contrast that's kind of throughout this text, is the contrast of faith and worry. And you see those who worry are of little faith, and those who have great faith will see all the needs that they need met in God. And so he gives us those contrasts. Now, last week I told you about Sinclair Ferguson. Well, this morning I want to read a little bit from John R.W. Stott, S-T-O-T-T. And so I found a selection here that I thought you would really appreciate. And I'll just go ahead and read it because it's a good summary of what we've just looked at. Then we must consider what is more worthy of our devotion. Only when we have grasped it with our minds and comparative durability of the two treasures, corruptible and incorruptible, the comparative usefulness of the two eye conditions, light and darkness, and the comparative worth of the two masters, God and mammon, are we ready to make our choice? And only when we have made our choice for heavenly treasure, for light, for God, therefore I tell you how you must go on to behave. Do not be anxious about your life, nor your body, but seek first his kingdom and his righteousness. In other words, our basic choice is of what two masters we intend to serve will radically affect our attitude to both. We shall not be anxious about the one, for we have rejected it, but concentrate our mind and energy on the other, for we have chosen him. We shall refuse to become engrossed in our own concerns, but instead seek first the concerns of God. Then one more little section. He says, it is not natural for people to drift aimlessly through life like plankton. We need something to live for, something to give meaning to our existence, something to seek, something on which to set our hearts and our minds. Although few people today would use the language of the ancient Greek philosophers, yet what we are seeking for is in fact what they call the supreme good, to which we dedicate our lives. Probably ambition is the best modern equivalent. True, in dictionary terms, it means a strong desire to achieve success, and therefore often has a bad image, a selfish flavor. It is in this sense that Shakespeare of King Henry VIII brings his appeal to Thomas Cromwell. Cromwell, I charge thee, fling away ambition. By that sin fell the angels. But ambition can equally refer to other strong desires, unselfish rather than selfish, godly rather than worldly. In a word, it is possible to be ambitious for God. Anyway, I thought that was really good. And so I want to continually expose everyone to good books, good things that you can be pouring your mind and supplanting. John Stott was an incredible preacher from England, and everything he writes is worth reading. Sinclair Ferguson, I'll try to get some more of his books in. Everything he writes is mandatory reading. And so I'll try to get those to you because I want you to be trained in, just in case I drop dead in the middle of a sermon, you'll drag the carcass away and finish the message. And so if we see that God has a plan for our lives which is way beyond what we can imagine, and we must be focused on him to achieve the right kind of ambition so that we will in fact be living out the plan for which he created us. And so I think that when we start talking about the worries of life, worries, I think, are when we take our mind off of where God is pointing us. We get sidetracked. It has the idea of where Martha was so, she was distracted by all the things she was doing. So here she had Jesus with her teaching, and she was so distracted by all the things in her, getting the meal ready, that she even wanted to drag little Mary away from sitting at Jesus' feet. And Jesus said, no, she's chosen the right thing. And I think that when you realize that it's the worries of the world, when the seed was sown on the different soils, it was the worries that strangled them and choked out the word. And so I believe that this is very important because we seem to live in a time where we're being pulled away from the things of God. And Paul wrote this. In essence, Jesus commanded us to do not be worried about your life. And the way that construction is it's assuming you're already doing it, and now he's demanding to stop doing what you're doing and kind of get a life. Stop worrying about your life. And Paul wrote this in the very same essence. He said, be anxious for nothing. And in the literal, it means not one single thing. Don't be anxious for one thing, but in everything by prayer. Philippians 4:6. And the word for life that's demonstrated here is the word suke, and it means the life of our emotions, the life of our spirit, the life of our intellect. It has the idea of the complexity of our entire life. And so Sinclair Ferguson writes this: for Absolutely nothing in any aspect of our lives, internal or external, justifies our being anxious when we have the master we do. And so, anxiety is a very real thing today. I was looking up a lot of statistics and all that, and they say that 49% of the people today have anxiety problems. 49%. If you have 10 people in the room, 5 of them have anxiety issues. And I went through all the listings. It was just a large selection of all the things, reasons why. It was everything from having too much news, knowing that evil is happening in some place, and it could happen to you, because something happened in some far part of the world, terrorism, and it went through all these details, and I started getting anxious just reading about all the things I'm supposed to be anxious about. And according to Psychology Today, anxiety is a feeling of worry, nervousness, or unease, typically about an imminent event or something with an uncertain outcome. And when you get down to the simplicity of what Jesus is saying, that worrying is a sin of distrusting the promise and the providence of God. The promise and the providence. And the providence speaks of His supremacy over everything, and He, in an overreaching way, does something without your permission or mine, such as giving birth to you, that kind of thing. It's a providential thing which you have no choice in, and it just happens. And yet He also gives us promises. It comes from an old English word meaning to strangle or choke. And in fact, worry is a kind of mental, emotional strangulation, which probably causes more mental and physical afflictions than any other single cause. I was thinking about a picture of worry, and they say that if you have a very dense fog, enough to cover 7 city blocks, 100 feet deep, it's composed of less water than 1 glass. 1 glass of water will fog an area that big. In fact, it's divided into 60,000 million droplets, and in the right form, a few gallons of water could cripple an entire city. Make it so that you couldn't see anything in front of you. Isn't that amazing, though? I've never thought of this, but we could make millions of dollars with a fog weapon. I mean, you and I, you want to get rich, that's a pretty good way. Gavin, work on it. You can do it. And there's a couple of people here that help you do that software. Anyway, I think that worry is in the same way. The substance of worry is so little, and this is what one author wrote, it's extremely small compared to the size it forms in our minds. In other words, worry is so little of reality. It mostly is things you're afraid of that never will happen. One woman said, worry works. It never happens. I just worry about it and it never happens. Anyway. Someone has said this, that the worry is a thin stream of fear that trickles through the mind, which, if encouraged, will cut a channel so wide that all other thoughts are drained out. So in other words, it's so distracting that it can empty your mind of all the good stuff around you. I believe that worry is a way of, like a hole in a bucket. You know, if you fill the bucket with water, and you put a hole in the bucket, no matter how fast and far you go, the water's going to leak out. And the longer it takes you to get to your destination, the less water you'll have. There's a song that was written, there's a hole in the bucket, dear Liza, dear Liza. Anyway, there lies a hole, anyway.
Dear Henry.
Well, worry is rooted, guess what, in material things. Temporal value system. Worrying more about the things that are only here for time than about the things that are here for eternity. That's what worry is all about. Someone has said that he was a youth worker, and if he could not conquer 3 things in people's lives, then he would never be successful with spreading Christianity, and it would never stay. The first one was he had to help them overcome bitterness. The second one, he had to help them overcome a temporal value system. And the third one is he had to help them conquer immorality. So when you have those three, that unholy trinity, it's right in there. So worry is right in there among the big ones that destroy Christians. And so when Jesus gave his message, his basic message was that we should not worry, and even about necessities. And how many of you have ever struggled with worry? And most of you never have, but you know somebody. And so this is for them. Jesus made this statement and connected the two together. He said, you cannot serve God and wealth. For this reason, I say to you, do not be worried about your life. It's connected to this unholy double master. And the first point that I'm going to ask is simply that, or is going to state, is that simply worry is very unproductive. It is a waste. When we try to serve God and money, we worry. And in the language of slavery, that's what this language is in this text. The concept of two masters is unthinkable, because a slave was purchased by one master, and someone else can't purchase him and claim to be his master too. It's kind of an oxymoron. Two masters. It's like experienced teenager, or jumbo shrimp, or happy camper. It's an oxymoron. Two masters for one slave. It's not thinkable. And yet that's exactly the point Jesus is making. Of the Roman Empire, it was 120 million people. There were at least 63 million slaves. Because as they conquered the world, they conquered an area and then enslaved all its people. So as it conquered everywhere it went, it would haul the people off as slaves to work in the mines or the gardens or the different projects they had in mind. Now the danger of material possessions is in their becoming master in God's place. You ever notice if you get a job, sometimes that job will say, well, we're going to work on Sundays. Okay? And all of a sudden now, that job rules you, and you can't even go to church. And I think that it's not a sin to have to work on Sunday. But what I did when I was working at a factory where we made mobile offices, we had 70 men working there, and I was in the welding shop, and so I would make everything they wanted metal. And they said that we're going to be working 24-hour shifts 7 days a week. And then I just gently talked to the manager, and I said to him, I'm not available on Sundays. And that's what I said to him. I said, that's my day of worship. Now, according to the Constitution, I have a right to do that, and actually the law. And so I said it very carefully and knew what I was talking about, but unfortunately they laid me off pretty soon. Instead of being servants of the Lord, whose service is perfect freedom, we become slaves of what God has made, and even to what man has made, possessions. The solution is found in the word contentment. Contentment is simply the belief that God has given me everything I need for my present and future happiness. It's a faith believing that God is interested in me, and I have been given what I need for my happiness. So I can be content where I am, instead of driven. God owns everything, He controls everything, and He provides everything. That settles it. See, God is my provider. He owns everything, and He is sovereignly over everything. Some of the people who wanted us to work Sundays, I lived to see the day that they were fired. I just want you to know that. David wrote this, the earth is the Lord's and all it contains, the world and those who dwell in it. Is there anything God does not own? And if you go through that Psalm 24, it's an incredible verse that talks not only about the ownership of God over the world, but that at the very end it says, lift up your heads, O gates, and be lifted up, O ancient doors, that the King of glory may come in. It's a messianic song. Who is the King of glory? Exactly. The Lord strong and mighty. He is the King of glory. And so he's going to come one day and take possession. But right now he just owns it all. And David basically stated a psalm that if we took it serious, we would never worry. Because the root cause of worry is thinking we own anything. That's the root cause. We take up ownership of anything in our lives. And when we dedicate our lives to the Lord, it's important at the same time that we relinquish all of our rights to ownership of anything in our lives. MacArthur writes this. He said, everything we now have belongs to the Lord, and everything we will ever have belongs to Him. Why then do we worry about His taking from us what really belongs to Him? Many people struggle with tithing, and right in the context of Malachi 3, it says, the Lord owns that tithe. And He says, will man rob God? And they say, well, how have we robbed Thee? And it's a really wonderful setting. These people are religious and justifying all the evil they do. And then Malachi is talking to them about straightening out, how do you get back with God? And God says, well, you're keeping the tithe that belongs to the Lord. And I think of myself as having so much faith if I tithe. Oh boy, I have so much faith. Whoa, I'm impressed. And God says, well, actually I own that, and you're just making sure I get my property. And in the context, it says, see if I will not open the windows of heaven and pour out a blessing you can't even contain. And I went, whoa, that's cool. By giving God what belongs to Him, He promises to bless us beyond what we can hold. And then the last part is interesting. A lot of people don't read that. It says, I'll actually rebuke the devourer, the one who takes away our crops, the one who would make our tire goes flat before it should, make the car wear out. In other words, He'll make what we own last longer. And I think that's a pretty wonderful thing to have confidence in, that God, when I tithe, God becomes a sharer in my bills. So that's just extra. I took a side road, chasing rabbits, you know. And so let's go back to contentment a little bit. John Wesley was away from his home one day when someone came running up and they said, your house is burned down. Your house is burned down. And to which Wesley replied, no, it hasn't, because I don't own a house. The one I've been living in belongs to the Lord, and if it is burned down, that is one less responsibility for me to worry about. Contentment is believing that God has provided everything I need for my present happiness. God has provided it. See, if you go around and you just look at the commercials that are always trying to tell you, you need a trip to the Caribbean. And if you get there, we'll give you the pajamas you can wear. They're nice and cuddly, and you won't have to get out of bed. You can watch TV all night and sleep all day, and we're going to bring you food, and we're going to bring you bubbles for your bath, and all kinds of, you can get a massage, and the person who massages you will be, for the ladies, he'll be a real hunk, and for the guys, it'll be a real babe. And everything about this trip is going to be so cool for one little price, and you can charge it, pay for it later. It's just going to be cool. Can you take the time? Anyway, but what does the word contentment come from? It comes from the Greek word archeo, which means to be satisfied, to be strong. And it has the idea that all my needs are met. And contentment comes when we realize that God is all we really need. And sometimes you have to go through the loss of everything to realize that God is all you really need. Hebrews 13:5 says this, make sure that your character is free from the love of money, being content with what you have. For He Himself has said, I will never desert you, nor will I ever forsake you. Contentment carries with it that idea that God is always with you, that He is really what you need. The opposite of contentment is covetousness, and listen to the way that is couched. When a man came up to Jesus one day from the crowd, he just kind of shouted out to him. He said, Jesus, help me with my brother. He won't share the inheritance with me. And Jesus said, hey everybody, I want to show you a total example of greed right here. So he's got everybody to come into him, and this is what he said to them: beware and be on your guard against every form of greed. For not even when one has an abundance does his life consist of his possessions. And I think that sometimes money not only doesn't satisfy, but it creates a desire for more. And there's nothing wrong in the scripture with enjoying anything we have, nor having possessions, nor plans, nor work, nor all that. That's nothing wrong with that at all. In fact, that's actually biblical. And there's nothing wrong with planning, as we'll see in a moment. But it's really the idolatry of loving money that kicks in. Idolatry is trusting people or possessions to do for me what only God can do. It's really that when we look at contentment, it's truly living with the freedom from ownership. And since I'm owned by God, not by my possessions, if I try to own my possessions, then I become owned by them. My possessions will possess me. But if everything is yielded to God, and I'm just the steward overseeing His property, that means if I have a talent, God expects me to do something with it. You know, if I'm going to be a future great musician and I don't bother developing it, or if I'm an artist, or if I'm a writer, or whatever I am, if I don't do anything with it, God's going to hold me accountable. So that's not discontentment, that's just simply being faithful. That's showing faith. But the idea is that I'm relaxed, I'm happy, because God is with me. God is leading me one step. Sometimes God gives me enough light for one or two little steps forward. That's it. Spurgeon said this: it's not how much we have, it's how much we enjoy that makes happiness. Now let's look at the second aspect of, we know that anxiety is unproductive. Worry doesn't accomplish anything. It distracts, it pulls us away from God. But also, anxiety is totally unnecessary. And it's not necessary for you to be motivated by anxiety. And God demonstrates His care throughout life, throughout nature. Worry isn't logical because He values you and me more than anything. And when we understand that, it's illogical for us to think that He won't take care of us like He takes care of everything else. For this reason I say to you, do not be worried about your life as to what you shall eat or drink, nor for your body as to what you shall put on. Is not life more than food, and the body more than clothing? God is the answer to worry because He cares for us. He actually will provide food and clothing to us. Notice what He says. And again, He's talking to people who are poor. Many of them were hungry. In that age, people were not likely to have more than one change of clothes their entire life. And clothing was considered wealth. In fact, the wealthiest people often would weave gold and silver into the clothing. And in ladies' hair, when Paul talked about braiding hair, don't have your hair like that. Well, it's because at the day, women would braid gold and all the family's wealth into her hair. So when she went to town, she was not just heavy, she with riches, but she was worth a lot. And so when you consider that clothing was a form of wealth, when Jesus said this, He's talking to people that He's really speaking their language. Food and clothing were wealth. In fact, money was often stored in grain. Wealth, how much grain did you have in the barn? That was money. And so that makes it a little more real when it says where rust destroys, oxidation. And there's actually a different word for rust. I think it has the concept of mold. Anyway, it's an interesting word. Where rust and thieves break in and steal and all that. You can see when you put your wealth in some of those kinds of things, they can be destroyed. They can be damaged. And so He said, look at the birds of the air. They do not sow, nor reap, nor gather into barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not worth much more than they? A friend of mine was losing a lot of money, and I heard about a girl who was going blind in one eye. And her family mortgaged everything they had, sold everything they had to pay for her to be, to have that surgery, I guess, where they could have even replaced the eye with another person's eye, a transplant. But they did everything, they lost it all. And, but they were happy because they had saved this eyesight of their daughter. And I was telling my friend this. I said, well, you have a beautiful daughter. I said, what would you say if she was going blind and you needed to sell everything you had to keep her from going blind? Would you do it? He says, yes. I said, well, your daughter, good news, your daughter's not going blind. But you do have to get rid of everything you have. But isn't it better to have to lose something that's material than to have your daughter need that surgery? And he said, yeah. I said, see, things could always be worse. And suppose, like one family, we watched the big, long documentary on her. She had gone as a newspaper reporter to Syria, or one of those countries, and been kidnapped by Taliban. And they sent notice to the family for hundreds of thousands of dollars in ransom that they demanded. And no one was going to help the family. So the woman worked night and day to raise the money. And then she hired a guy who was, kung fu, karate. He was a living weapon to deliver the money so they wouldn't steal the money and make sure he got the daughter back. And then they got the daughter back and they interviewed the daughter and all of that. And you can see that there are things that can happen to us that will take all of our money. And so that's why it's so important not to own it. That's why it's so important in this life, if we have security based on anything that can be taken away, or like our health, which we can lose, or anything that this world can take away, basically we're going to be insecure. We're going to be fearful. We're going to worry. Look at the birds of the air. Worry is useless, but notice also it's unnecessary since God controls and cares for all things. Do you not know that you're worth more than the birds? Worry says you're not worth more than the birds. And when you have faith, you say, God puts great value on me. Faith looks at the birds and lets them remind us of how much God will care for us. I have these bird feeders, and we have fun chasing the squirrels away from them. And so I greased the pole many times, and I love watching the squirrel go up and slip down, He doesn't do it very much because he wipes off the grease, and pretty soon he gets up there. Next thing he's upside down, gorging himself, filling his cheeks with the bird food. And the birds, they don't do a good job defending their food. But this is a little poem that some of you probably heard before that I thought it was good. Said the robin to the sparrow, I should really like to know why these anxious human beings rush about and worry so. Said the sparrow to the robin, friend, I think that it must be that they have no heavenly Father such as cares for you and me. Worry is worthless. It doesn't benefit us or change anything. Faith, on the other hand, opens our eyes to God's care and His provisions for all creation. What can worry do? Absolutely nothing. And this is what Jesus said, and who of you, by being worried, can add a single hour to his life? And some of them talk about how this word actually refers to height. A single cubit or a single something to his life, a smidgen of growth. I've always wondered if I could just worry hard enough, then maybe I could grow 6 more inches and join the NFL. Really fun dinner we had Friday night. Some of you remember the football quarterback Jim Zorn. Well, Diane and I and Annie were part of a group called the C.S. Lewis Institute, and Joy Zorn, his wife, is part of our group. She's one of the mentors. And so she had us over to the house, and of course I wanted to dress properly. I wore what I'm wearing now, and my highest level of suits. And when I got there was this rough-looking shabbily dressed guy cooking all the food. Well, that was Jim Zorn. And I'm not saying it derogatory. He was, he was bigger than me, so I would never say anything bad against him. But, everything about it was just delightful, and we had a wonderful time. But when we start thinking about worry changing our lives or changing anything about our lives, making us, if we could cash in on it, it'd be worth it. If it did any good, it'd probably be a good thing. But it doesn't. And Jesus asked the question, why do you worry about clothing? Observe how the lilies of the field grow. They do not toil, they do not spin. Yet I say to you that not even Solomon in all his glory clothed himself like one of these. Flowers are one of the most beautiful things on the earth. They're natural, they're incredibly gorgeous, and there's probably millions of varieties. One year I was at Disneyland, Disney World. It was in the winter, and I was just amazed at the beautiful flowers and the gardens they have there. And they said, no, this is nothing. We have over 1 million varieties of flowers and plants and all kinds of really interesting plants, and the most interesting in the world. And they said, in the springtime, they all come to bloom. So that's when you come and see the plants. And they truly are gorgeous, and Jesus is simply saying, hey, that we dress them better. We dress them better than Solomon. He had all the money he could ask for. His clothing was shabby compared to how we dress the flowers. And the grasses, they're tended by God's lawn service. Even though they're temporary, he takes incredible care of them. And it says, but if God so clothes the grass of the field, which is alive today and tomorrow is thrown into the furnace. They used it to quick start their ovens. And will he not much more clothe you, you of little faith? That's not the way that you get your audience to come on to you. You call them, you say you're faithless, but it's the truth. And when we have worry, we have no faith. 1 Peter 5:7 puts it this way, casting all your care upon him, for he cares for you. And the word cast there is not the normal word for throwing something away. According to James Boyce in his Sermon on the Mount, he says this, it signifies a definite act of the will by which we stop worrying about things and let God assume the responsibility for our welfare. The word casting, I think it's the word ekbala, anyway. Bala is to throw, and ek is to out of there, And it literally here, the word care is a play on that word. It literally means he is mindful of you and your interests. It's a care that goes deeper than we can imagine. So we cast all of our care by our will. We just said, God, I give it to you, and then I know you care for me. That's the way our prayer can be. I think worry is also very unreasonable. It says, do not worry then, saying, what shall we eat? What shall we drink? What shall we wear for clothing? And the reason it's unreasonable is because everybody who doesn't believe in God is pursuing all these things. And when we are faithful, we seek God with confidence that he will provide our needs. But some of us are going through times of difficulty, and we experience that. We experience God in how he provides for us, for our needs. One man said this, he said, need is evidence of God's supply. So when you have a genuine need and you're seeking God, that's evidence that God will supply. So watch him supply. When I was a little bit younger, I had 4 children. And as they each came, what's that?
Still do.
I still do, yeah. But I had 4 children getting to college age. And I said, how are we going to afford this? And each time, with each one of my children, it was amazing, stunning to see how God provided for their needs. With grants and different things, not borrowing very much money. And I remember Annie's story was kind of fun. you can ask her about it. She was at Oxford. Now here's a poor man with children at Oxford. Enough to make your nose go up like that and talk a little bit, you know. But here they were there, and Annie was only going to be there for a few weeks. And they said, we really like Annie, we don't want her to leave. And so we raised the money for her to spend the whole year studying.
There was one man that donated money.
One man donated. Oh, great. Thank you for that very embarrassing interruption. No, just kidding.
Just brought your nose down.
I feel great now. Like I always like to feel. But God provided, through one man's donation, $40,000 for her to stay another rest of the year. She was only supposed to be there a few weeks.
Oh.
And then a whole year of studying at Oxford at the master's level in apologetics. And then they were saying to her that we'd like you to join our theology department. And then Annie says, but I don't even have a bachelor's degree yet. How can I enter into a graduate level type thing? And he says, no problem. And then they called this man over. It was at the C.S. Lewis Institute right at the Kilns where C.S. Lewis was. And they introduced Annie to this man who was the president of SPU. And he gave her a 4-year scholarship. And so...
She didn't get a full ride, though.
Full ride. It was pretty full.
No, it wasn't.
We can talk about this maybe...
She always discussed
She's
it.
still in debt, more debt than me.
Talk to Diane about
Steve, you want me to escort her out?
Yeah.
Get out of this one. But the fun thing was
Back
to see...
But it makes a
To
good
see
story.
how the point,
Fake news.
how did God
Well
do this?
provided for.
But the fun thing is that God provided that with my children, you see, because He wanted to provide. And the point is that if He does it for one person, He'll do it for another. Because He doesn't value me above anyone. He values all of us, His children. We're His kids. And God knows what we need, and God will provide our needs. That's the point. And so if we make God's priorities our priorities, then our needs will be God's provision. And I think that Jesus said, but the Gentiles eagerly seek all these things, for your heavenly Father knows the things that you need all these things. But seek first His kingdom and His righteousness, and all these things will be added to you as well. And then, kind of in a way of final admonition Jesus gives, because our tendency, okay, we're not going to worry, I'm not going to worry, but then we're kind of worried about tomorrow, because that's the unknown. And we all have subtle worries in us. And He says this, so, it's kind of a summary point, do not worry about tomorrow. For tomorrow will care for itself. Each day has enough trouble of its own. And one man said this, he said, don't use up tomorrow's grace or today's grace on tomorrow's trials. Anticipating a trial is often worse than going through it. So what are some keys to going through and overcoming worry, anxiety in our lives? First of all, just realize that all these provisions really are only for believers, only for Christians, God's people. And we always, it's one thing to say, God works everything together for good to somebody, but if they're not a believer, He doesn't. He doesn't care for those who aren't His own. He gives what they call general grace or something like that for everybody. He causes the sun and the rain to fall on everybody, whether they're good or evil. And God does take care of the world. But there is a sense where God has special care for His children. And these promises are really for believers. And so you always want to say, okay, God, I'm a believer. And you can sing the song all day, hey, I'm a believer now, since Jesus changed my mind, and all that. Great song. But I think the second part of that is getting to know God. And we learn about God's nature and His ability. What's God's nature? He's a father. He is so much in love with His children. And then, and his ability to provide is right there too. Here's just one scripture which you might want to put to memory. It's Matthew 11, 28 and 20 through 30. Come to me, all who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Now say it with me. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. That's really the spirit of invitation for you to come to him, especially when you're going through difficulties in your life. And I think the third one is just simply develop a habit of turning to God the moment you begin to worry about anything. Just say, God, this is really a concern for me, and I want to give it to you. I want you to know that I'm just dedicating it to you. I want you to please give me wisdom, show me what you want me to do, but I give to you this difficulty right now. And you keep doing that until God gives you peace. And you may have to, one person was struggling with anger over how they'd been mistreated, and every day it would kind of come on this lady, and I said to her, I said, you know, every day that you become angry, and same with anxiety, I said, just go through that same process, forgiving that person, asking God to bless him, and then go through the process of thanking God for the difficulty you're going through. Specifically, we give thanks for and in and for all things. And then as we give thanks to God for all those things, then we can realize that he will come and he will minister to us. I said, you're just going to have to go through that process every time you get mad. And so that way you can kind of get past it. Go through it again and again and again, every day. And then the same way with when you are struggling with anxiety, just learn to take it to him. Prayer. There's a man in the early Greek manuscripts, and his name was Tydidius Merimnos. And Merimnos is the word for worry. And it has a prefix which means not. And so when he became a Christian, many of the Christians in the early days changed their names. James the Just, the Christian martyr. He was a man who wanted to live as a Christian and die as a Christian. And then there was many men, John the Elder, John the Younger, and all that kind of thing. But when they followed after Jesus, they changed their name. And this man worried all the time. And when he changed his name, he said, after he became a believer, he said, I'm never going to worry again. I'm going to give everything in my life to Jesus. I'm going to trust him for every step I take. So he changed his name to Tydidius, the man who never worries, Merimnos. And now the question I want to ask is, how about some of you changing your name? If you know that you have a tendency to worry, just say, you know, my name is not worry. Put your name in the beginning, Steve, no worry. You know, and just begin to call yourself a man and a woman who does not worry. A businessman who does not worry. And begin just to say, because I have such a great Father, he takes such good care of me, I'm not going to worry. So let's just give our hearts to the Lord. Father, thank you that you are such a gracious and wonderful God. And you have given us many instances in this text where we are not to be anxious, not to worry. And we give to you, Lord, everything that we would normally worry about. We offer to you, Father, our lives as we seek to do your will and to give ourselves to two things, Lord, your kingdom, your rule in our lives, and your righteousness. Then all these things can be added to us as well. And we can be people who never worry, because our purpose in life is to submit to you and to be your man, your woman. And we give to you, Lord, everything in our lives, fresh and anew. In Jesus' name we thank you.
Jim not.
It's very small, and it doesn't have much picture. Today I brought Dylan, next time I'm going to
Yeah. It's like, now I don't care where it's parked
No, it's in
today,
Florida,
you know?
but in the back, if you look behind,
Last night was pretty.
it's not really meant for people with long-term travel. There's no back, it's just, it's hurting back problems. So I haven't changed, kind of changed. But today's no.
What do you have left to do for it? Are you all done?
Oh, this is not
I know, so yeah, there's still that, so I
a very little area for the back was straight. There was no. And so they're trying to have that on that.
Right? What's the opposite of worry? That's like carefree. Trusting desserts. You know there's never pressure to like.
Just send them to my phone.
Tuesday morning, you guys there at
Sent to my phone, it would be under messages. Unless you're, that is,